ever to fulfill its mission the way art has done.
Just need to do the same. Again, you get tons. And that, what is the role of science? Station with Ann Druyan. What is the role of science in our society?
Well, I think of what Einstein said when he opened the 1939 New York World's Fair. He said, if science is ever to fulfill its mission the way art has done, it must penetrate. Its inner meaning must penetrate the consciousness of everyone. And so for me, especially in a civilization dependent on high technology and science, one that aspires to be democratic, it's critical that the public, as informed decision makers, understand the values and the methods and the rules of science.
Do you think about what you just mentioned, the values and the methods and the rules and maybe the technology that science produces, but what about sort of the beauty, the mystery of science?
Well, you've touched on what I think is, for me, that's how my way into science is, that for me, it's much more spiritually uplifting. The revelations of science, collective revelations of really countless generations of searchers, and the little tiny bit we know about reality is the greatest joy for me, because I think that it relates to the idea of love. Like, what is love that is based on illusion about the other? That's not love. Love is seeing unflinching the other and accepting with all your heart. And to me, knowing the universe as it is, or the little bit that we're able to understand at this point, is the purest kind of love. And therefore, how can our philosophy, our religion, if it's rootless in nature, how can it really be true? I just don't understand. So I think you need science to get a sense of the real romance of life and the great experience of being awake in the cosmos.
The fact that we know so little, the humbling nature of that. So you kind of connect love to that, but isn't it scary? Why is it so inspiring, do you think? Why is it so beautiful that we know so little?
Well, first of all, as Socrates thought, knowing that you know little is really knowing something, knowing more than others. And it's that voice whispering in our heads, you might be wrong. Which I think is not only, it's really healthy because we're so imperfect, we're human, of course, but also, love to me is the feeling that you always want to go deeper, get closer. You can't get enough of it. You can't get close enough, deep enough. So, and that's what science is always saying. Science is never simply content with its understanding of any aspect of nature. It's always finding that even smaller cosmos beneath. So I think the two are very much parallel.
So you said that love is not an illusion.
No, it's not.
So
well, if it is,
what is love?
What is love is knowing, for me, love is knowing something deeply and still being completely gratified by it, and wanting to know more. So what is love? What is loving someone, a person, let's say, deeply, is not idealizing them, not putting some kind of subjective projection on them, but knowing them as they are. And so for me, the only aperture to that knowing about nature, the universe, is science, because it has that error-correcting mechanism that most of the stuff that we do doesn't have. You could say the Bill of Rights is kind of an error-correcting mechanism, which is one of the things I really appreciate about the society in which I live. to the extent that it's upheld and we keep faith with it. And the same with science. It's like we will give you the highest rewards we have for proving us wrong about something. That's genius. That's why in only 400 years since Galileo's first look through a telescope, we can get from this really dim, vague apprehension of another world to sending our eyes and our senses there, or even to going beyond. So it delivers the goods like nothing else, it delivers the goods because it's always self-aware of its fallibility.
So on that topic, I'd like to ask just your opinion and a feeling I have that I'm not sure what to do with, which is the skeptical aspect of science. So the modern skeptics community, and just in general, certain scientists, many scientists, maybe most scientists that apply this scientific method are kind of rigorous in that application, and it feels like sometimes miss out some of the ideas outside the reach of, just slightly outside the reach of science, and they don't dare to sort of dream or think of revolutionary ideas that others will call crazy in this particular moment. So how do you think about the skeptical aspect of science that is really good at sort of keeping us in check, keeping us humble, but at the same time, sort of the kind of dreams that you and Carl Sagan have inspired in the world, it kind of shuts it down sometimes a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's up to the individual, but for me, I was so ridiculously fortunate in that my tutorial in science, because I'm not a scientist and I wasn't trained in science, was 20 years of days and nights with Carl Sagan. And I think the reason Carl remains so beloved, well, I think there are many reasons, but at the root of it is the fact that his skepticism was never at the cost of his wonder, and his wonder was never at the cost of his skepticism. So he couldn't fool himself into believing something he wanted to believe because it made him feel good. But on the other hand, he recognized that what nature is really, it's good enough, It's way better than our fantasies.
Yeah.
And so if you're that kind of person who loves happiness, loves life, and your eyes are wide open and you read everything you can get your hands on, and you spend years studying what is known so far about the universe, then you have that capacity, a really infinite capacity to be alive, and also at the same time to be very rigorous about what you're willing to believe. For Carl, I don't think he ever felt that his skepticism cost him anything, because again, it comes back to love. He wanted to know what nature really was like, not to inflict his, preconceived notions on what he wanted it to be. So you can't go wrong, because it doesn't, I think the Pale Blue Dot is a perfect example of his massive achievement. Is to say, okay, or the Voyager record is another example, is here we have this mission, our first reconnaissance of the outer solar system. Well, how can we make it a mission in which we absolutely squeeze every drop of consciousness and understanding from it? We don't have to be scientists and then be human beings. I think that's the tragedy of Western civilization, is that it's one of its greatest gifts. It has been science, and yet at the same time, it believing that we are the children of a disappointed father, a tyrant, who puts us in a maximum security prison and calls it paradise, who looks at us, who watches us every moment, and hates us for being our human selves, And then, most of all, what is our great sin? It's partaking of the tree of knowledge, which is our greatest gift as humans, this pattern recognition, this ability to see things and then synthesize them and jump to conclusions about them and test those conclusions. So I think the reason that in literature, in movies, the scientist is a figure of alienation, a figure, or you see these biopics about scientists, and yeah, he might have been great, but, he was missing a check. He was a lousy husband. He lacked, the kind of spiritual understanding that maybe, his wife had. And it's always in the end they come around. But to me, that's a false dichotomy, that we are, to the extent that we are aware of our surroundings and understand them, which is what science makes it possible for us to do, we're even more alive.
So you mentioned a million awesome things there. Let's even just, can you tell me about the Voyager 1 and 2 spacecraft and the Interstellar Message Project and that whole just fascinating world leading up to
one of my favorite subjects. I love talking about it. I'll never get over it.
Yeah.
I'll never be able to really wrap my head around the reality of it, the truth of it.
What is it, first of all? What's the Voyager spacecraft?
Okay, so Voyagers 1 and 2 were our first reconnaissance mission of what was then considered the outer solar system. And it was a gift of gravity, the idea that swinging around these worlds gives you a gravitational assist, which ultimately will send you out of the solar system to wander the Milky Way galaxy for 1 to 5 billion years. So Voyager gave us our first close-up look of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. It discovered new moons. It discovered volcanoes on Io. Its achievements are astonishing. And remember, this is technology from the early to mid 1970s.
And it's still active.
And it's still active. We talked to Voyager a few days ago. We talked to it, in fact, a year ago, I think it was. We needed to slightly change the attitude of the spacecraft. And so we fired up its thrusters for the first time since 1987.
Do they work?
Instantly. It was as if you had left your car in the garage in 1987.
Yeah.
And you put the key in the ignition, because you used keys then in the ignition, and it turned over the first time you stepped on the gas.
Wow.
And so that's the genius of the engineering of Voyager. And Carl was one of the key participants in imagining what its mission would be, because it was a gift, actually, of the fact that every 175 years, plus or minus, there is an alignment of the worlds. And so you could send 2 spacecraft to these other worlds and photograph them and use your mass spectrometer and all the other devices on Voyager to really explore these worlds.
And it's the farthest spacecraft, it's the farthest human creation away from us today.
Yes,
right?
Voyager 1.
Voyager 1.
These 2 spacecraft not only gave us our first close-up look at hundreds of moons and planets, these planets, but also it told us the shape of the solar system as it moves through the galaxy, because there were 2 of them going in different directions.
Yeah.
And they arrived at a place called the heliopause, which is where the wind from the sun, the solar wind, dies down and the interstellar medium begins. And both Voyagers were the first spacecraft that we had that could tell us when that happened. So it's a consummate, I think it's the greatest scientific achievement of the 20th century.
And engineering in some sense.
Engineering. I mean, really, Voyager is doing this on less energy than you have in your toaster. Something like 11 watts. So, okay, but because of this gravitational assist, both Voyagers were destined, as I say, first of all, they were supposed to function for a dozen years. And now it's 42 years since launch, and we're still talking to them. So that's amazing. But prior to launch, almost a year, 8-9 months prior to launch, it was decided that since Frank Drake and Carl Sagan and Linda Salzman had created something called the Pioneer 10 plaque for the Pioneer spacecraft that preceded Voyager, which was kind of like a license plate for the planet Earth. You know, a man and a woman, hands up, you know, very basic, but very effective. And it captured the imagination of people all over the world. And so NASA turned to Frank and to Carl and said, we'd like you to do a message for Voyager, because if it's going to be circumnavigating the Milky Way galaxy for 1 to 5 billion years, you know, it's like 20 trips around the galaxy. And there's a very small chance that a spacefaring civilization would be able to flag one of them down. And so on board you see this exquisite golden disc with scientific hieroglyphics explaining our address and various basic scientific concepts that we believe that would be common to any spacefaring civilization. And then beneath this exquisite golden disc is the Voyager record, the golden record, and it contains something like 118 photographs, images of life on Earth, as well as 27 pieces of music from all around the world. Many people describe it as the invention of world music. World music was not a concept that existed before the Voyager record, and we were determined to take our music, not just from the technical cultures, but from all of the rich cultural heritage of the Earth. And there's a sound essay, which is a kind of using a microphone as a camera to tell the story of the Earth, beginning with its geological sounds and moving into biology and then into technology. And like I think what you were getting at is that at the end of this sound essay, I had asked Carl if it were in the making of the record, it was my honor to be the creative director of the project. If it was possible if I had meditated for an hour while I was hooked up so that, you know, every single signal that was coming from my brain, my body, was recorded and then converted into sound for the record. Was it possible that these putative extraterrestrials of the distant future, of perhaps 1 billion years from now, would be able to reconstitute this message and to understand it? And he just, big smile, you know, and just said, well, hey, 1 billion years is a long time.
It's a long time.
Go do it. And so I did this.
And what were you thinking about in the meditation? Like it's such an interesting idea of recording as you think about things. What were you thinking about?
So I was blindfolded and couldn't hear anything. And I had made a mental itinerary of exactly where I wanted to go. I was truly humbled by the idea that these thoughts could conceivably touch the distant future.
Yeah, that's incredible.
So it's 1977. There are some 60,000 nuclear weapons on the planet. The Soviet Union and the United States are engaged in a, to the death competition. And so I began by trying to tell the history of the planet in, to my limited ability, what I understood about the story of the early existence of the planet, about the origin of life, about the evolution of life, about the history of humans, about our current, at that time, predicament, about the fact that 1 in 5 of us was starving or unable to get potable water. And so I sort of gave a kind of, as general a picture as I possibly could of our predicament. And
Mexico Tower, Boeing Alpha
I
Sierra,
also
X-ray Golf Sierra, and runway 23
was
left ready for
very
departure, straight out
newly,
departure.
within days of the moment when Carl and I fell in love with each other. Maybe we fell in love with each other long before because we've known each other for years. But it was the first time that we had expressed our feelings for each other.
Acknowledged it, the existence of this
Yes,
love.
because we were both involved with other people, and it was completely outside his morality and mine to even broach the subject. But it was only days after that it happened, and for me it was a eureka moment. It was in the context of finding that piece of Chinese music that was worthy to represent one of the oldest musical traditions on Earth, when those of us who worked on the Voyager record were completely ignorant about Chinese music. And so that had been a constant challenge for me, talking to professors of Chinese music, ethnomusicologists everywhere, and all through the project, desperately trying to find this one piece. Found the piece, and on the Upper West Side, found the piece. The professor at Columbia University gave it to me, and he's, of all the people I talked to, everyone had said, you can't have that, there can't be one piece of Chinese music. But he was completely, no problem, I've got it. And so he told me the story of the piece which only made it an even greater candidate for the record. And I listened to it, called Carl Sagan, who was in Tucson, Arizona, addressing the American Society of Newspaper Editors. And I left him a message, hotel message center. And he called me back an hour later. And beautiful. See, I get back to my hotel room and I find this message that Annie wrote. And I asked myself, why didn't you give me this message 10 years ago? My heart was beating out of my chest. It was for me a kind of eureka moment, a kind of scientific breakthrough. A truth, a great truth had suddenly been revealed. And of course I was awkward and didn't really know what to say, and so I blurted something out like, I really need to talk to you about that, which wasn't really true. I never would have talked to him about it. We had been alone countless times.
We humans are so awkward in these beautiful moments.
In these amazing moments. And I just said, for keeps. And he thought for a very brief, like a second, and said, you mean get married? And I said, yeah. And he said, yeah. And we put down the phone. Literally jumping around my apartment like a lunatic because it was so obvious, it was something like, of course. And then the phone rang again, and I thought, damn, no, he's going to say I didn't know what I was doing. I am married, I have a kid, I'm not going to do this, But he was like, I just want to make sure that really happened. And I said, yeah. He said, we're getting married. And I said, yeah, we're getting married. Now, this was June 1st, 1977. The records had not been affixed to the spacecraft yet, and there had been a lot of controversy about what we were doing. I should say that there, among the 118 pictures was an image of a man and a woman, frontally, completely naked. And there was like leave congressmen or had said NASA to send smut to the stars, And so NASA really they got very upset and said, you can't send a picture. And we had done it, so it was so brilliant. It was like this lovely couple, completely naked, and then the next image was a kind of overlay schematic to show the fetus inside this woman that was developing. And then that went off into, additional imagery of human reproduction. And it really hit me that how much we hate ourselves, that we couldn't bear to be seen as we are. So,
in some sense, that congressman also represents our society.
Yeah.
Perhaps his opposition should have been included as well.
Yes, well, that was one of the most vigorous debates during the making of the record with the 5 or 6 people that collaborated with, was do we only put our best foot forward, or do we show Hiroshima, Auschwitz, the Congo, what we have done?
What do you think represents humanity? If you think about it, our darker moments, are they essential for humanity? All the wars we've been through, all the tortures and the suffering and the cruelty, is that essential for happiness, for beauty, for creation, generally
Well, it's
speaking?
certainly not essential for happiness or beauty, that's for sure. I mean, it's part of who we are, if we're going to be real about it, which is, I think we tell on ourselves even if we don't want to be real. I think that if you're a spacefaring civilization and you've gotten it together sufficiently that you can move from world to world, then I think they probably took one look at this derelict spacecraft and they knew that these were people in their technological adolescence.
Yeah.
And they were just setting forth. And they must have had these issues. Because it's... And so, it really, that's the great thing about lying, is that a lie only has a shelf life. Like a great work of art that's a forgery. People can be fooled immediately, but 10 or 15 years, 20 years later, they start to look at it and, they begin to realize that the lens, our lens of our present, is coloring everything that we see. So, I think it didn't matter that we didn't show our atrocities.
It would fill in the blanks.
They would fill in the blanks.
So let me sort of ask, you mentioned how unlikely it is that you and Carl, the two souls like yours, would meet in this vast world. What are your views on how and why incredibly unlikely things like these nevertheless do happen?
It's purely, to me, chance. It's totally random. It's and the fact is that some people are, and it's happening every day right now, some people are the random casualties of chance. And I don't just mean the people who are being, destroyed in childhood and wartime. I'm also for the people who starve to death because of famine. But also the people who are not living to the fullest. All of these things, I think there's a way. My parents met on the subway in rush hour. And so I'm only here with you because of the most random possible situation. And so I've had a sense of this even before I knew Carl. I always felt this way, that I only existed because of the generosity.
The rush hour.
Of just all of the things, all of the games of causality.
It's interesting because, the rush hour is a source of stress for a lot of people, but clearly in its moments can also be a source of something beautiful.
That's right.
Of strangers meeting and so on. So everything has a possibility of doing something
That's
beautiful.
Right.
Let me ask sort of a quick tangent on Voyager, this beautiful romantic notion that Voyager 1 is our farthest human reach into space. If you think of what, I don't know if you've seen what Elon Musk did with putting the Roadster, letting it fly out into space. There's a sort of humor to it. I think that's also kind of interesting. But maybe you can comment on that. But in general, if now that we are developing, we're venturing out into space again in a more serious way, what kind of stuff that represent since Voyager was launched should we send out as a follow-up? Is there things that you think that's developed in the next in the 40 years after that we should update the spacefaring aliens?
Well, of course, now we could send the worldwide. We could send everything that's on the World Wide Web. We could send, I mean, that was a time when we were talking about phonograph records and transistor radios. And,
Right.
So we tried to take advantage of the existing technology to the fullest extent. The computer that was hooked up to me from my brainwaves and my heart sounds while I was meditating was the size of a gigantic room, and I'm sure it didn't have the power of a phone. The phone has now. So, now we could I think we could let it all hang out. We could just send, that's the wonder. Like, I would send, Wikipedia or something and not be a gatekeeper, but show
That's interesting because
who we are.
you were also. It's interesting because one of the problems of the internet, of having so much information, is it's actually the curation, the human curation is still the powerful, beautiful thing.
Yes.
So what you did with the record is it's exactly the right process. It's kind of boiling down a massive amount of possibilities of what you could send into something that represents, the better angels of our nature or represents our humanity. So if you think about, what would you send from the internet as opposed to sending all of Wikipedia, for example, all of human knowledge? Is there something just new that we've developed, you think? Or fundamentally, we're still the same kind of human species?
I think fundamentally we're the same, but we have we have advanced to an astonishing degree in our capacity for data retrieval and for transmission. And so, I would send YouTube. I would send, really, like, think of all the, I still feel so lucky that there's any great musical artist of the last 100 years who I revere. I can just find them and watch them and listen to them. And, that's fantastic. I also love how democratic it is that we each become curators and that we each decide those things. Now, I may not agree with, the choices that everyone makes, but of course not, because that's not the point. The point is that we are, we have discovered largely through the internet that we are an intercommunicating organism, and that can only be good.
So you could also send now Cosmos.
Yes, I'd love to. I would be proud to.
I mean, you've spoken about a very specific voice that Cosmos had in that it reveals the magic of science. I think you said shamanic journey of it, and not the details of the latest breakthroughs or so on. It's just revealing the magic. Can you try to describe what this voice of Cosmos is with the follow-up and the new Cosmos that you're working on now?
Yes, well, the dream of Cosmos is really like Einstein's quote, it's the idea of the awesome power of science to be in absolutely everyone's hands. It belongs to all of us. It's not the preserve of a priesthood. It's just as the community of science is becoming more diverse and being less exclusive than it was guilty of in the not-so-recent past. The discoveries of science, our understanding of the cosmos that we live in, has really grown by leaps and bounds, and probably could learn more in the last 100 years about it The tempo of discovery has picked up so rapidly. And so the idea of cosmos from the 1970s, when Carl and I and Stephen Soter, another astronomer, first imagined it, was that interweaving not only of these scientific concepts and revelations and using, cinematic VFX to take the viewer on this transporting, uplifting journey, but also the stories of the searchers. Because the more I have learned about, the process of science through my life with Carl and since, the more I am really persuaded that it's that adherence to the facts and to that adherence to that little approximation, that little bit of reality that we've been able to get our hands around is something that we desperately need. And it doesn't matter if you are a scientist. In fact, it matters even more if you're not. And since, the level of science teaching has been fairly or unfairly maligned,
500.
and the idea that once there was such a thing as a television network, which of course has now evolved into many other things, the idea that you could, in the most democratic way, make accessible to absolutely everyone, and most especially people who don't even realize that they have an interest in a subject or who feel so intimidated by the jargon of science and its kind of exclusive history. The idea that we could do this, and, in season 2 of Cosmos, The Space-Time Odyssey, we were in 181 countries in the space of 2 weeks. It was the largest rollout in television history, which is really amazing there is no science-based programming.
By the way, just to clarify, the series was rolled out, so it was shown in that many countries. You said we were in.
Well, our show was
show.
in 180 countries.
Yeah, the show, which is
Yes.
incredible. I mean, the hundreds of millions, whatever that number is, the people that watched it, it's crazy.
It's so crazy that, for instance, my son had a cerebral hemorrhage a year ago, and the doctor who saved his life in a very dangerous situation, when he realized that, that Sam and I were who we were, he said, "That's why I'm here." He said, "If you come of age in a poor country like Colombia, and Carl Sagan calls you to science when you're a child, then you go to medicine because that's the only avenue open to you. But that's why I'm here." And I have heard that story, and I hear that story, I think, every week. And
How does that make you feel? I mean, the number of scientists, I mean, a lot of it is quiet, right? But the number of scientists Cosmos has created is just countless. I mean, it probably touched the lives, I don't know, probably, it could be a crazy number of 90% of scientists or something have been.
I would love to do that census because because that's the greatest gratification, because that's the dream of science. That's the whole idea, is that if it belongs to all of us and not just a tiny few, then we have some chance of determining how it's used. And if it's only in the hands of people whose only interests are the balance sheet or hegemony over other nations, things like that, then it'll probably end up being a gun aimed at our heads. But if it's distributed in the widest possible way, a capability that we now have because of our technology, then the chance is that that it will be used with wisdom. That's the dream of it. So that's why we did the first Cosmos. We wanted to take not just, as I say, the scientific information, but also tell the stories of these searchers. Because for us and for me, in carrying on this series in the second and third seasons. The primary interest was that we wouldn't tell a story unless it was kind of a threefold. It was not just a way to understand a new a scientific idea, but it was also a way to understand what, if it matters what's true, how the world can change for us and how we can be protected. And if it doesn't matter what's true, then we're in grave danger because we have the capability to not only destroy ourselves and our civilization, but to take so many species with us.
And I'd like to talk to you about that particular, the sort of the dangers of ourselves in a little bit, but sort of to linger on Cosmos. Maybe for the 1980 and the 2014 follow-up, what's one of the or several memorable moments from the creation of either of those seasons?
Well, the critical thing really was the fact that Seth MacFarlane became our champion, because I had been with 3 colleagues. I had been schlepping around from network to network with a treatment for Cosmos, and every network said they wanted to do it. But they wouldn't give me creative control, and they wouldn't give me enough money to make it cinematic and to make it feel like you were really going on an adventure. And so...
And I think both of those things, sorry to interrupt, both of those things are, given what Cosmos represents, the legacy of it, the legacy of Carl Sagan is essential. Control, especially in the modern world. It's wonderful that you sought control, that you did not relinquish it.
And I kept saying no. And my partners, I'm sure, I know, they would look at me like I was nuts, and they probably must have entertained the idea that maybe I didn't really want to do it, because I was afraid or something. Yeah. But I kept saying no, and it wasn't until I met Seth MacFarlane. Yeah. And he took me to Fox and to Peter Rice and said, I'll pay for half the pilot if I have to, and Peter Rice was like, put your money away. Yeah. And
Seth said that.
Yeah. Yeah. And in every time since, in the 10 years since, at every turn, when we needed Seth to intervene on our behalf, he stood up and he did it. And so that was like, in a way, that is the watershed for me of everything that followed since. And then I was so lucky because, Steve Soder and I written the original Cosmos with Carl, and we collaborated on the treatment for season 2. And then Brandon Braga came into our project at the perfect moment and has proven to be I have been so lucky my whole life. I've been lucky with my collaborators have been extraordinary. And so that was a critical thing. But also to have, for instance, our astonishing VFX supervisor who comes from the movies, who heads the Global Association of VFX people, Jeff Okan. And then I could rattle off 10 more names. I'd be happy to do that. And it was that collaboration.
So the people were essential to the creation of...
Absolutely. I mean, when it came down, I have to say that when it came down to the vision of what the series would be, that was me sitting in my home, looking out the window and, really imagining like what I wanted to do.
Can you pause on that for a second? Like, what's that process? Because, Cosmos is also, it's grounded in science, of course, but it's also incredibly imaginative, and the words used are carefully crafted.
Thank you.
So if you can talk about the process of that, the big picture, imaginative thinking, and sort of the rigorous crafting of words that like basically turns into something like poetry.
Thank you so much. For me, these are rare occasions for human self-esteem. The scientists that we bring to life in Cosmos are people, in my view, who have everything we need to see us through this current crisis. It's very often they come, they're poor, they're female, they're outsiders who are not expected to have gifts that are so prodigious, but they persevere. And so you have someone like Michael Faraday, who comes from a dysfunctional family of like 14 people, and it never goes to university, never learns the math, but there's Einstein years later looking up at the picture of Faraday to inspire him. So it's if we had people with that kind of humility and unselfishness who didn't want to patent everything. As Michael Faraday created the wealth of the 20th century with his various inventions. And yet he never took out a single patent at a time when people were patenting everything, because that was not what he was about. And to me, that's a kind of almost a saintliness that says that, that here's a man who finds in his life this tremendous gratification from searching. And it's just so impressive to me. And there are so many other people in Cosmos, especially the new season of Cosmos, which is called Possible Worlds.
Beautiful title.
Possible Worlds. Well, I stole it from an author and a scientist from the 1940s. But it for me encapsulates not just, the exoplanets that we've begun to discover, not just, the worlds that we might visit, but also the world that this could be, a hopeful vision of the future. You ask me, what is common to all 3 seasons of Cosmos, or what is that voice? Yes. It's a voice of hope. It's a voice that says there is a future which we bring to life in, I think, a fairly dazzling fashion that we can still have, And in sitting down to imagine what this season would be, the new season would be, I'm sitting where I live in Ithaca, beautiful, just a gorgeous place, trees everywhere, waterfalls.
Yeah.
I'm sitting there thinking, well, you can't, how do you awaken people? I mean, you can't yell at them and say, we're all going to die. It's not, it doesn't help. It doesn't help. But I think if you give them a vision of the future that's not pie in the sky, but something, ways in which science can be redemptive, can actually remediate our future. We have those capabilities right now, as well as the capabilities to do things in the cosmos that we could be doing right now, but we're not doing them. Not because we don't know how, with the engineering or the material sciences or the physics, we know all we need to know. But we're a little bit paralyzed in some sense. And, I always think we're like the toddler, like we left our mother's legs, and scurried out to the moon.
Yeah.
And we had a moment of, wow, we can do this. And then we realized, and somehow we had a failure of nerve. And we went scurrying back to our mother and, did things that really weren't going to get us out there, like the space shuttle, things like that, because it was a kind of failure of nerve. So Cosmos is about overcoming those fears.
We're now, as a civilization, ready to be a teenager venturing out into college. We're returning back.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's one of my theories about our current situation, is that this is our adolescence. And I was a total mess as an adolescent. I was reckless, irresponsible, totally. Yeah. I was inconsiderate. Yeah. The reality of other people's feelings and the future didn't exist for me. So why should a technologically adolescent civilization be any different? Right. But, the vast majority of people I know made it through that period and went on to be more wise. And that's what my hope is for our civilization.
So on a sort of darker and more difficult subject, in terms of, so you just talked about the cosmos being an inspiration for science and for us growing out of our messy adolescence. But nevertheless, there is threats in this world. So do you worry about existential threats like you mentioned nuclear weapons? Do you worry about nuclear war?
Yes.
And if you could also maybe comment, I don't know how much you've thought about it, but well, there's folks like Elon Musk who are worried about the existential threats of artificial intelligence, sort of our robotic computer creations, sort of resulting in us humans losing control. So can you speak to the things that worry you in terms of existential concerns?
Yeah, all of the above. You'd have to be silly, like not to think and not to look at, for instance, our rapidly burgeoning capability in artificial intelligence, and to see how sick so much of the planet is, not to be concerned. And
Sick is an evil potentially.
well, how much cruelty and brutality is happening at this very moment. And I would put climate change higher up on that list because I believe that there are unforeseen discoveries that we are making right now. For instance, all that methane that's coming out of the ocean floor that was sequestered because of the permafrost, which is now melting. I think there are other effects besides our greed and short-term thinking, that we are triggering now with all the greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere. And that worries me day and night. I think about it every moment, really, because I really think that's how we have to be. We have to begin to really focus on how grave the challenge is to our civilization and to the other species that are. This is a mass extinction event that we're living through, and we're seeing it. We're seeing news of it every day.
So what do you think about another touchy subject? But what do you think about the politicization of science on topics like global warming, embryonic stem cell research, and other topics like it? What's your sense? Why?
What do you mean by the politicization of global warming?
Meaning that if you say, I think what you just said, which is global warming is a serious concern, it's human caused, there might be some detrimental effects. Currently, there's a large percent of the population of the United States that would, as opposed to listening to that statement, would immediately think, oh, that's just a liberal talking point. That's what I mean by
I think that's not
politicization.
so true anymore. I don't think our problem is a population that's skeptical about climate change, because I think that the extreme weather fire events that we are experiencing with such frequency is really gotten to people. I think that there are people in leadership positions who choose to ignore it and to pretend it's not there. But ultimately, I think they will be rejected. The question is, will it be fast enough? But I think actually that most people have really finally taken the reality of global climate change to heart. And they look at their children and grandchildren, and they don't feel good because they come from a world which was, in many ways, in terms of climate, fairly familiar and benign. And they know that we're headed in another direction. And it's not just that, it's what we do to the oceans, the rivers, the air. You asked me, like, what is the message of Cosmos?
Right.
It's that we have to think in longer terms. I think of the Soviet Union and the United States in the Cold War, and they're ready to kill each other over these two different views of the distribution of resources. But neither of them has a form of human social organization that thinks in terms of 100 years, let alone 1,000 years, which are the timescales that science speaks in. And that's part of the problem, is that we have to get a grip on reality and where we're headed. And I'm not fatalistic at all. But I do feel like, and in setting out to do this series, each season, we were talking about climate change in the original Cosmos in episode 4.
Yeah.
And warning about inadvertent climate modification in 1980. And of course, Carl did his PhD thesis on the greenhouse effect on Venus, and he was painfully cognizant of what a runaway greenhouse effect would do to our planet. And not only that, but the climatic history of the planet, which we go into in great detail in the series. So, yeah, I mean, how are we going to get a grip on this if not through some kind of understanding of science? Can I just say one more thing about science, is that its powers of prophecy are astonishing.
Yes.
You launch a spacecraft in 1977, and you know where each and every planet in the solar system is going to be, and every moon. Yeah. And you rendezvous with that flawlessly, and you exceed the design specifications of the greatest dreams of the engineers. And then you go on to explore the Milky Way galaxy, and you do it. I mean, the climate scientists, some of the people whose stories we tell in Cosmos, their predictions were, and they were working with very early computer modeling capabilities. They have proven to be so robust. Nuclear winter, all of these things. This is a prophetic power. And yet how crazy that, it's like the Romans with their lead cooking pots and their lead pipes, or the Aztecs ripping out their own people's hearts. This is us. We know better, and yet we are acting as if it's business as usual.
Yeah, the beautiful complexity of human nature. Speaking of which, let me ask a tough question, I guess, because there's so many possible answers. But what aspect of life here on Earth do you find most fascinating? From the origin of life, the evolutionary process itself, the origin of the human mind, so intelligence, some of the technological developments going on now, or us venturing out into space with space exploration. What just inspires you?
Oh, they all inspire me.
Oh, yeah.
Every one of those inspire me. But I have to say that, to me, at the origin, as I've gotten older, to me, the origin of life has become less interesting.
Interesting, wow.
Because I feel, not because it's more, I think I understand, I have a better grasp of how it might have happened.
Do you think it was a huge leap? So
I think it was we are a byproduct of geophysics. And I think it's not, my suspicion, of course, which is, take it with a grain of salt, but my suspicion is that it happens more often in more places than we like to think. Because, after all, the history of our thinking about ourselves has been a constant series of demotions in which we've had to realize, no. So to me, that's...
We're not at the center of the solar system.
And the origin of consciousness is, to me, also not so amazing. If you think of it as, going back to these one-celled organisms of 1 billion years ago, who, had to know, well, if I go higher up, I'll get too much sun, and if I go lower down, I'll be protected from, UV rays, things like that. They had to know that. Or you, I eat. Me, I don't. I mean, even that, I can see. If you know that, then knowing what we know now is not so hard to fathom. It seems like, I've never believed there was a duality between our minds and our bodies. And I think that
even consciousness, all those
things seem to me, except one of the
byproduct
things,
of geophysics. I love it.
well, chemistry, yes. Geochemistry, geophysics, absolutely. It makes perfect sense to me. And it doesn't make it any less wondrous. It doesn't rob it at all of the wonder of it. And so, yeah, I think that's amazing. I think, we tell the story of someone you have never heard of, I guarantee, and I think you're very knowledgeable on the subject, who was more responsible for our ability to venture out to other worlds than anyone else, and who was completely forgotten. And so those are the kinds of stories I like best for Cosmos. Because
Could you tell me who?
no, I'm going to make you watch this series. I'm going to make you
All right.
buy my book.
Beautiful.
And, but I'm just saying, like, this person would be forgotten.
Yes.
But,
No.
the way that we do Cosmos is that, like, I ask a question to myself. I really want to get to the bottom, to the answer, and keep going deeper until we find what the story is. A story that I know, because I'm not a scientist, if it moves me, then I want to tell it, and other people will be moved.
Do you ponder mortality?
Yes.
Human mortality, and maybe even your own mortality?
Oh, all the time. I just turned 70. So yeah, I think about it a lot. I mean, it's, how can you not think about it? But
what do you make of this short life of ours? I mean, let me ask it sort of another way. You've lost Carl. And speaking of mortality, if you could choose immortality, it's possible that science allows us to live much, much longer. Is that something you would choose for yourself, for Carl, for you?
Well,
two?
for Carl, definitely. I would have,
For you two
in
together.
a nanosecond, I would take that deal. But not for me. I mean, if Carl were alive, yes, I would want to live forever, because I know it would be fun. But no.
Would it be fun forever?
I don't know.
The essential
I don't know. It's
nature
just
of
that the universe is so full of so many wonderful things to discover that it feels like it would be fun. But no, I don't want to live forever. I have had a magical life. My craziest dreams have come true. And I feel, forgive me, but this crazy quirk of fate that put my most joyful, deepest feelings that decades later, 42 years later, I know how real, how true those feelings were. Everything that happened after that was an affirmation of how true those feelings were. And so I don't feel that way. I feel like I have gotten so much more than my share. Not just my extraordinary life with Carl, my family, my parents, my children, my friends, the places that I've been able to explore, the books I've read, the music I've heard. So I feel like, if it would be much better if, instead of working on the immortality of the lucky few, of the most privileged people in this society, I would really like to see a concerted effort for us to get our act together. That to me is topic A. More pressing, this possible world. That is the challenge. And we're at a kind of moment where if we can make that choice. So immortality doesn't really interest me. I love nature, and I have to say that I because I'm a product of nature, I recognize that it's great gifts and it's great cruelty.
Well, I don't think there's a better way to end it. Amy, thank you so much for talking. It was an honor.
Oh, it's wonderful.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I thought your questions were great.
Thanks for listening to this conversation with Ann Druyan, and thank you to our presenting sponsor, Cash App. Download it, use code LEXPODCAST. You'll get $10, and $10 will go to First.
and the methodology of reduction. So I won't say they did it. Whatever reality is.
That in your book, The Case Against, dear friends, here's Don. You won't know which is which. Madness and consciousness. He's the author of
What you see.
The following is a conversation with Donald Hoffman, professor of cognitive sciences at UC Irvine, focusing his research on evolutionary psychology, visual perception, and consciousness. He's the author of over 120 scientific papers on these topics, and his most recent book titled The Case Against Reality: Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes. I think some of the most interesting ideas in this world, like those of Donald Hoffman's, attempt to shake the foundation of our understanding of reality, and thus they take a long time to internalize deeply. So proceed with caution. Questioning the fabric of reality can lead you to either madness or the truth. And the funny thing is, you won't know which is which. This is the Lex Friedman Podcast. To support it, please check out our sponsors in the description. And now, dear friends, here's Donald Hoffman. In your book, The Case Against Reality: Why Evolution Hid the Truth from Our Eyes, you make the bold claim that the world we see with our eyes is not real. It's not even an abstraction of objective reality. It is completely detached from objective reality. Can you explain this idea?
Right, so this is a theorem from evolution by natural selection. So the technical question that I and my team asked was, what is the probability that natural selection would shape sensory systems to see true properties of objective reality? And to our surprise, we found that the answer is precisely zero, except for one kind of structure that we can go into if you want to. But for any generic structure that you might think the world might have, a total order, a topology, metric, probability is precisely zero that natural selection would shape any sensory system of any organism to see any aspect of objective reality. So in that sense, what we're seeing is what we need to see to stay alive long enough to reproduce. So in other words, we're seeing what we need to guide adaptive behavior. Full stop.
So, the evolutionary process, the process that took us from the origin of life on Earth to the humans that we are today, that process does not maximize for truth, it maximizes for fitness, as you say. Fitness beats truth. And fitness does not have to be connected to truth, is the claim. And that's where you have an approach towards zero of probability, that we have evolved human cognition, human consciousness, whatever it is, the magic that makes our mind work, evolved not for its ability to see the truth of reality, but its ability to survive in the environment.
That's exactly right. So most of us intuitively think that surely the way that evolution will make our senses more fit is to make them tell us more truths, or at least the truths we need to know about objective reality, the truths we need in our niche. That's the standard view, and it was the view I took. I mean, that's sort of what we were taught, or just even assumed. It was just sort of like the intelligent assumption that we would all make. But we don't have to just wave our hands. Evolution by natural selection is a mathematically precise theory. John Maynard Smith in the 70s created evolutionary game theory, and we have evolutionary graph theory and even genetic algorithms that we can use to study this. And so we don't have to wave our hands. It's a matter of theorem and proof, and or simulation before you get the theorems and proofs. And a couple of graduate students of mine, Justin Mark and Brian Marion, did some wonderful simulations that tipped me off that there was something going on here. And then I went to a mathematician, Chetan Prakash and Manish Singh, and some other friends of mine, Chris Fields. But Chetan was the real mathematician behind all this, and he's proved several theorems that uniformly indicate that, with one exception, which has to do with probability measures, there's no probability of zero. The reason there's an exception for probability measures, so-called sigma algebras or sigma additive classes, is that for any scientific theory, there is the assumption that needs to be made that whatever structure, whatever probabilistic structure the world may have, is not unrelated to the probabilistic structure of our perceptions. If they were completely unrelated, then no science would be possible. So this is technically the map from reality to our senses has to be a so-called measurable map. It has to preserve sigma algebras. But that means it could be infinite to 1, and it could collapse all sorts of event information. But other than that, there's no requirement in standard evolutionary theory for fitness payoff functions, for example, to preserve any specific structures of objective reality. So you can ask the technical question. This is one of the avenues we took. If you look at all the fitness payoffs from whatever world structure you might want to imagine, so a world with, say, a total order on it. So it's got n states, they're totally ordered. And then you can have a set of maps from that world into a set of payoffs, say from 0 to 1,000 or whatever you want your payoffs to be. And you can just literally count all the payoff functions. Just do the combinatorics and count them. Then you can ask the precise question, how many of those payoff functions preserve the total order, if that's what you're looking, or how many preserve the topology? And you just count them and divide. So the number that are homomorphisms versus the total number, and then take the limit as the number of states in the world, and the number of payoff values goes very large. And when you do that, you get 0 everything.
Okay, there's a million things to ask here, but first of all, just in case people are not familiar with your work, let's sort of linger on the big, bold statement here, which is the thing we see with our eyes is not some kind of limited window into reality. It is completely detached from reality, likely completely detached from reality. You're saying 100% likely. Okay, so none of this is real in the way we think is real. In the way we have this intuition, there's like this table is some kind of abstraction, but underneath it all, there's atoms. And there's an entire century of physics that describes the functioning of those atoms and the quarks that make them up. There's many Nobel Prizes about particles, fields, and all that kind of stuff that slowly builds up to something that's perceivable to us, both with our eyes, with our different senses, as this table. Then there's also ideas of chemistry that over layers of abstraction, from DNA to embryos to cells that make the human body. So all of that is not real.
It's a real experience, and it's a real adaptive set of perceptions. So it's an adaptive set of perceptions, full stop. We want to think
the
that
perceptions are real.
So their perceptions are real as perceptions, right? They are. We are having our perceptions, but we've assumed that there's a pretty tight relationship between our perceptions and reality. If I look up and see the moon, then there is something that exists in space and time that matches what I perceive. And all I'm saying is that if you take evolution by natural selection seriously, then that is precluded. That our perceptions are there. They're there to guide adaptive behavior, full stop. They're not there to show you the truth. In fact, the way I think about it is they're there to hide the truth because the truth is too complicated. It's just like if you're trying to, use your laptop to write an email, right? What you're doing is toggling voltages in the computer. But good luck trying to do it that way. That's the reason why we have a user interface is because we don't want to know that quote-unquote truth with diodes and resistors and all that terrible hardware. If you had to know all that truth, it would, your friends wouldn't hear from you. So what evolution gave us was perceptions that guide adaptive behavior, and part of that process, it turns out, means hiding the truth and giving you eye candy.
So what's the difference between hiding the truth and forming abstractions, layers upon layers of abstractions over low-level voltages and transistors and chips, programming languages from assembly to Python that then leads you to be able to have an interface like Chrome where you open up another set of JavaScript and HTML programming languages that lead you to have a graphical user interface on which you can then send your friends an email. is that completely detached from the zeros and ones that are firing away inside?
It's not. Of course, when I talk about the user interface on your desktop, there's this whole sophisticated backstory to it, right? That the hardware and the software that's allowing that to happen. Evolution doesn't tell us the backstory, right? So the theory of evolution is not going to be adequate to tell you what is that backstory. It's going to say that whatever reality is, and that's the interesting thing, it says whatever reality is, you don't see it. You see a user interface, but it doesn't tell you what that user interface is, how it's built. Right, now we can try to look at certain aspects of the interface, but already we're going to look at that and go, okay, before I would look at neurons and I was assuming that I was seeing something that was at least partially true. And now I'm realizing it could be like looking at the pixels on my desktop or icons on my desktop, and good luck, going from that to the data structures and then the voltages, and then good luck. There's just no way. So what's interesting about this is that our scientific theories are precise enough and rigorous enough to tell us certain limits, and even limits of the theories themselves. But they're not going to tell us what the next move is, and that's where scientific creativity comes in. So the stuff that I'm saying here, for example, is not alien to physicists. The physicists are saying precisely the same thing, that space-time is doomed. We've assumed that space-time is fundamental. We've assumed that for several centuries, and it's been very useful. So all the things that you were mentioning, particles and all the work that's been done, that's all been done in space-time. But now physicists are saying space-time is doomed. There's no such thing as space-time fundamental in the laws of physics. And that comes actually out of gravity together with quantum field theory. It just comes right out of it. It's a theorem of those two theories put together. But it doesn't tell you what's behind it. So the physicists know that their best theories, Einstein's gravity and quantum field theory together, entail that space-time cannot be fundamental, and therefore particles in space-time cannot be fundamental. They're just irreducible representations of the symmetries of space-time. That's what they are. So space-time, so we put the two together. We put together what the physicists are discovering, and we can talk about how they do that. And then the new discoveries from evolution and natural selection. Both of these discoveries are really in the last 20 years. And what both are saying is space-time has had a good ride. It's been very useful. Reductionism has been useful, but it's over. And it's time for us to go beyond.
When you say space-time is doomed, is it the space? Is it the time? Is it the very hard-coded specification of 4 dimensions? Or are you specifically referring to the kind of perceptual domain that humans operate in, which is space-time? You think like there's a 3D, like our world is 3-dimensional and time progresses forward, therefore 3 dimensions plus 1, 4D. What exactly do you mean by space-time? What do you mean by space-time is doomed?
Great. So this is, by the way, not my quote. This is from, for example, Nima Arkani-Hamed at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, Ed Witten, also there, David Gross, Nobel Prize winner. So this is not just something the cognitive scientists, this is what the physicists are saying.
Yeah, the physicists are space-time skeptics.
Yeah, they're saying that, and I can say exactly why they think it's doomed, but what they're saying is that, because your question was, what aspect of space-time, what are we talking about here? It's both space and time, their union into space-time as in Einstein's theory. That's doomed. And they're basically saying that even quantum theory, this is Nima Arkani-Hamed especially, so Hilbert spaces will not be fundamental either. So that the notion of Hilbert space, which is really critical to quantum field theory, quantum information theory, that's not going to figure in the fundamental new laws of physics. So what they're looking for is some new mathematical structures beyond space-time, beyond Einstein's 4-dimensional space-time, or supersymmetric version of geometric algebra signature 2,4 kind of. There are different ways that you can represent it, but they're finding new structures, and by the way, they're succeeding now. They found something called the amplituhedron. This is Nima and his colleagues. the cosmological polytope. There are these like polytopes, these polyhedra in multi dimensions, generalizations of simplices that are coding for example, the scattering amplitudes of processes in the Large Hadron Collider and other colliders. So they're finding that if they let go of space-time completely, they're finding new ways of computing these scattering amplitudes that turn literally billions of terms into one term. When you do it in space and time, because it's the wrong framework, it's just a user interface. That's now from the evolutionary point of view. It's just user interface. It's not a deep insight into the nature of reality. So it's missing deep symmetry. It's something called a dual conformal symmetry, which turns out to be true of the scattering data, but you can't see it in space-time. And it's making the computations way too complicated because you're trying to compute all the loops and Feynman diagrams and all the Feynman integrals. So see, the Feynman approach to the scattering amplitudes is trying to enforce two critical properties of space-time: locality and unitarity. So when you enforce those, you get all these loops and multiple, different levels of loops, and for each of those you have to add new terms to your computation. But when you do it outside of space-time, you don't have the notion of unitarity. You don't have the notion of locality. You have something deeper, and it's capturing some symmetries that are actually true of the data. But then when you look at the geometry of the facets of these polytopes, then certain of them will code for unitarity and locality. So it actually comes out of the structure of these deep polytopes. So what we're finding is there's this whole new world now beyond space-time that is making explicit symmetries that are true of the data that cannot be seen in space-time, and that is turning the computations from billions of terms to one or two or a handful of terms. So we're getting insights into symmetries, and all of a sudden the math is becoming simple because we're not doing something silly. We're not adding up all these loops in space-time. We're doing something far deeper. But they don't know what this world is about. So they're in an interesting position where we know that space-time is doomed, and I should probably tell you why it's doomed, what they're saying about why it's doomed. But they need a flashlight to look beyond space-time. What flashlight are we going to use to look into the dark beyond space-time? Because Einstein's theory and quantum theory can't tell us what's beyond them. All they can do is tell us that when you put us together, space-time is doomed at 10 to the minus 33 centimeters, 10 to the minus 43 seconds. Beyond that, space-time doesn't even make sense. It just has no operational definition. So, but it doesn't tell you what's beyond. And so they're just looking for deep structures, like guessing is really fun. So these really brilliant guys, generic, brilliant men and women who are doing this work, physicists, are making guesses about these structures, informed guesses, because they're trying to ask, well, okay, what deeper structure could give us the stuff that we're seeing in space-time, but without certain commitments that we have to make in space-time, like locality. So they make these brilliant guesses, and of course, most of the time you're going to be wrong. But once you get one or two that start to pay off, and then you get some lucky breaks. So they got a lucky break back in 1986. A couple of mathematicians named Park and Taylor took the scattering amplitude for 2 gluons coming in at high energy and 4 gluons going out at low energy. So that kind of scattering thing. So like apparently for people who are into this, that's sort of something that happens so often you need to be able to find it and get rid of those because you already know about that and so you needed to compute them. It was billions of terms. And they couldn't do it, even for the supercomputers couldn't do that for the many billions or millions of times per second they needed to do it. So they begged, the experimentalists begged the theorists, please, you got it. And so Park and Taylor took the billions of terms, hundreds of pages, and miraculously turned it into 9. And then a little bit later, they guessed one term expression that turned out to be equivalent. So billions of terms reduced to one term, the so-called famous Park-Taylor formula, 1986. And that was like, okay, where did that come from? What? This is a pointer into a deep realm beyond space and time, but no one, what can you do with it? And they thought maybe it was a one-off, but then other formulas started coming up, and then eventually Nima Arkani Hamed and his team found this thing called the amplitude-hedron, which really sort of captures the whole, a big part of the whole ball of wax. I'm sure they would say, no, there's plenty more to do. So I won't say they did it all by any means. They're looking at the cosmological polytope as well. So what's remarkable to me is that 2 pillars of modern science, quantum field theory with gravity on the one hand, and evolution by natural selection on the other, just in the last 20 years have very clearly said space-time has had a good run. Reductionism has been a fantastic methodology. So we had a great ontology of space-time, a great methodology of reductionism. Now it's time for a new trick. But now you need to go deeper and show, but by the way, this doesn't mean we throw away everything we've done, not by a long shot. Every new idea that we come up with beyond space-time must project precisely into space-time, and it better give us back everything that we know and love in space-time, or generalizations, or it's not going to be taken seriously, and it shouldn't be. So we have a strong constraint on whatever we're going to do beyond space-time. It needs to project into space-time, and whatever this deeper theory is, it may not itself have evolution by natural selection. This may not be part of this deeper realm. But when we take whatever that thing is beyond space-time and project it into space-time, it has to look like evolution by natural selection, or it's wrong. So that's a strong constraint on this work.
So even the evolution by natural selection and quantum field theory could be interfaces into something that doesn't look anything like you mentioned. I mean, it's interesting to think that evolution might be a very crappy interface into something much deeper.
That's right. They're both telling us that the framework that you've had can only go so far, and it has to stop. And there's something beyond. And that framework, the very framework that is space and time itself. Now, of course, evolution by natural selection is not telling us about like Einstein's relativistic space-time. So that was another question you asked a little bit earlier. It's telling us more about our perceptual space and time, which we have used as the basis for creating first a Newtonian space versus time as a mathematical extension of our perceptions. And then Einstein then took that and extended it even further. So the relationship between what evolution is telling us and what the physicists are telling us is that, in some sense, the Newton and Einstein space-time are formulated as sort of rigorous extensions of our perceptual space, making it mathematically rigorous